All right, today we're going to break down a really significant and, let's be honest, incredibly controversial document. It's called the Leuchter Report. It started its life as a piece of evidence for a trial, but it grew into something much, much bigger. So let's dive in. We're going to walk through what this report actually is, where it came from, its key claims, and the major criticisms against it, all based on the source material from its critical edition.
So right out of the gate, the report's own introduction hits you with this. This quote perfectly captures the atmosphere the report was designed for. It's not just a statement, it's a declaration of intent. The goal was to use technical analysis to challenge and, as they put it, end what they called a myth. It really sets the stage for just how high stakes and provocative this document was meant to be from day one.
So the big question is, what is this report that inspired such a dramatic claim? Well, to really get it, you have to understand its origin story. And it wasn't born in a university research lab or a historian's office. Nope. Its story begins in a Canadian courthouse. So that's what this explainer's all about. Unpacking the report's findings and the arguments around them, straight from its own pages.
And that's our first big piece of the puzzle. The Leuchter Report wasn't an academic paper published for peer review. It was a document commissioned for one very specific reason, to be used as expert evidence in a criminal trial. And honestly, knowing that context is absolutely crucial to understanding everything that comes next.
Okay, so this is the specific legal drama that set the whole thing in motion. It's centered on a man named Ernst Zundel. He gets convicted in '85 in Canada for publishing what was considered false news. But then that conviction gets tossed out and a new trial is ordered. For the 1988 retrial, his defense team decided they needed a new strategy, a technical, forensic argument, and that is the exact moment the idea for the Leuchter Report was born.
So the defense didn't just hire any old engineer. They went looking for a very specific, and let's be honest, pretty unusual kind of expert. They found Fred Leuchter. At the time, this guy was America's top specialist in execution technology. He literally designed and built the equipment for U.S. prisons, lethal injection machines, electric chairs, and most importantly for this story, hydrogen cyanide gas chambers. The defense saw him as the perfect person to conduct a forensic investigation of the facilities in Poland.
Okay, so they've got their guy. What's next? Well, they had to go to the source. The report itself lays out exactly how Leuchter and his team went about their investigation when they traveled to the former concentration camps in Poland.
So this wasn't just some casual trip. Leuchter put together a whole team. A draftsman to make sketches, a cinematographer to film everything, and an interpreter. They spent about 8 days on the ground visiting Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Majdanek. And they weren't just looking around. They were taking detailed measurements, documenting the structures, and this is the most important part, they physically chiseled out 32 samples from the walls of the alleged gas chambers and delousing facilities to take back home for chemical testing.
Now, it's really important to understand what the report said it was trying to do. It was framed as a very specific engineering question. It wasn't asking what happened here in a broad historical sense. No, its stated goal was much narrower, to determine if the physical buildings themselves were capable of being used as mass execution gas chambers in the way historical accounts describe them. A purely functional question.
So, let's get into the meat of the report itself. Leuchter's conclusions really break down into two main categories. First, we'll look at his findings on the engineering and design of the facilities.
In this table is where Leuchter's unique expertise comes right to the forefront. He essentially creates a side-by-side comparison. On one side, you have the American execution gas chambers he actually builds. Think of them as high-tech, hermetically sealed steel pods with powerful ventilation, designed to be leak-proof. Then on the other side, you have what he observed at the camps. He describes them as simple brick-and-mortar buildings, totally unsealed, and lacking any of the critical systems for ventilation, heating, or safety that you'd need to handle a highly explosive and deadly gas like hydrogen cyanide.
The report also takes a look at the crematoria. Leuchter runs the numbers based on the number of furnaces, their design, fuel, all the operational logistics, and he calculates a maximum possible capacity. He comes up with this number, 1,043 cremations per week, total. And the entire point of this calculation in the report is to present a number that is drastically lower than the figure cited in mainstream historical records. So after all that technical analysis, this is the report's bottom line from an engineering perspective. This is the big conclusion in his own words. Based on his professional assessment of the design, the construction, the lack of ventilation, he concludes that these facilities simply could not have been used as execution gas chambers. Full stop.
But, the engineering stuff was only half the story. The other part, and maybe the part that got even more attention, was all about those 32 little pieces of brick and mortar that they brought back to the United States for testing.
Okay, so to get this next part, we need a quick chemistry lesson on something called Prussian blue. You can think of it like a chemical fingerprint. When hydrogen cyanide gas interacts with the iron that's naturally in building materials like brick and mortar, over a long time it can form this incredibly stable compound. This compound happens to be a pigment, and it can leave a very distinctive blue stain. The report argues this is a key forensic marker for long-term exposure to cyanide.
And this chart, this is really the aha moment that the entire report is built around. Leuchter's team took what's called a control sample from a delousing chamber, a room everyone agrees was used with Zyklon B gas to kill lice on clothing. That sample came back with a massive cyanide reading, 1,050 milligrams per kilogram. Now look at the contrast. The average of the samples from the alleged execution gas chambers, just 7. Barely a trace, if anything at all.
This huge difference, what the report's authors themselves call a spectacular discrepancy, is positioned as the absolute central pillar of its entire scientific claim. The argument is simple. If the alleged execution chambers were flooded with cyanide gas to kill people, they should have far more chemical residue than the delousing rooms, not exponentially less. To them, the chemistry just didn't add up.
Now, as you can probably imagine, these findings did not land in a vacuum. They were immediately and intensely challenged by historians and scientists, and the critical edition that we're using as our source for this explainer actually dedicates a huge amount of space to addressing that very criticism head-on.
The source document itself literally lists out and engages with a number of its key critics. These aren't obscure names. They include people like the French pharmacist Jean-Claude Prasek, researchers at the official Polish Forensic Institute in Krakow, and chemists like Dr. Richard Green, all of whom published detailed refutations of Leuchter's methods and his conclusions. So this slide really gets to the core of the scientific debate, as it's presented in the source document. The mainstream critique essentially says, hold on, the chemistry is way more complex. They argue that a short, intense gassing in a warm, moist room full of people breathing out CO2 creates very different chemical conditions than a long, slow delousing, conditions that would prevent that stable Prussian blue from forming. The rebuttal in the critical edition, written by chemist Germar Rudolph, basically says, okay, we agree the conditions were different, but are they different enough to explain a 1,000-to-1 ratio? That's not a small variation, that's a gigantic chemical gap that still needs explaining.
So in the end, the Leuchter report didn't really settle the scientific debate in the mainstream academic world. But what it did do was become an absolutely foundational text for the historical revisionist movement. For its proponents, this was the game changer, the first ever forensic, scientific-looking evidence that they could point to in support of their challenge to the mainstream narrative.
And that journey really brings us full circle. A document that starts its life as a piece of evidence in a Canadian courtroom becomes this ideological touchstone for a whole movement. It leaves us with a really big, complicated question. What happens when you apply the cold, hard tools of engineering and chemistry to something as deeply painful and complex as historical memory? The legacy of the Leuchter